So I tried Readwise for over 60 days, and in this video, I want to break down some of the dumb mistakes that I made early on, and I'm going to kind of make a decision at the end. Is this worth it? Am I going to continue to keep my subscription? So let's start with what Readwise is. So it is an app that I first discovered when I was kind of integrating with another app that I was using. It was like a note-taking app, and it basically allowed me to integrate with Readwise. And so at first glance, I was like, oh, okay, this is similar to like an Instapaper where when you see articles and stuff, you can send it to this reader. But then I discovered, okay, no, this actually consolidates all of your highlights from, Kindle and things like that you've taken, and all your highlights ever, right? And it begins to kind of send you like a daily email reviewing some of those highlights, because how often do you actually resurface some of the older stuff that you have highlighted? So I was intrigued when I signed up for the free trial and I began getting these emails. Now, I will say that I did not actually sign up after that for probably a couple months. Now, in that between time, what happened is I began this analog method of consolidating all of my highlights and notes and ideas using Ryan Holiday and Robert Greene's 4x6 note card system. So, for example, whenever I would, come across a highlight like this one's Mastery by Robert Greene, I would actually write it out, longhand. And it does take much longer to do this, and especially when you are trying to maybe copy longer amounts of text, it's slower, right? But it is one of those things, it's a practice that I feel pretty connected to. I like taking the time to do it, and it gives me a very tactile feel, right? Like these cards are in your hands, and it makes these highlights kind of come alive. But the problem was when I first heard of Readwise, I was like, okay, this seems to be something mainly for Kindle. And I've kind of had, I've been reading for decades at this point, and I always have this battle between, reading the paper version and reading the Kindle version. And of course, when you are reading on Kindle, if that's your primary way of reading, then Readwise seems way more appealing up front because as you're making these highlights, it's constantly storing them in one consolidated place. And it made me kind of question if it would be worth it for me, because I've kind of gone into the direction of having more paper books again over just the digital version. And I kind of was thinking to myself like, oh, do I need to get the Kindle version of the book? Because I do that sometimes with books that I like a lot, just so I can kind of make the highlights and read it on the go. But the part that I completely overlooked was the fact that you can actually manually add highlights, right? And so if I read a physical book, nowadays what I do is the first stage of capturing it for me is the highlight. So I don't try to highlight and then, catalog it in the same session many times. I will do that in a separate session where I kind of just go through and catalog everything, whether that is putting it on a note card or putting it into Readwise. So anyways, then what I start to do is I try inputting one of these highlights into Readwise. You can actually put your camera on top of the book and it will scan the text. You can do it that way, or you can manually type it out. After a couple times of doing this, particularly for a book that I just finished that was full, it was like 200 plus pages. I had like 30 plus highlights, and it did take me some time to put it into Readwise. But as I was doing so, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the digital version of the Ryan Holiday and Robert Greene note card system that I've been looking for, because I had made my own digital version where it's just kind of a Notion database and I add things and tag them in there. But for me, it feels like the way that Readwise is, there are some things like, of course, you can't just treat it like a physical note card and connect ideas between each other, but the way that they have a highlights feed and you can see books from literally 10 years ago that you read and highlighted, and then something from 10 days ago, and then something from 10 months ago. It is this constant, I think David Senra from Founders Podcast called it like smart scrolling. And I totally agree with that. The highlights feed on mobile feels like a very smart social feed that you are getting smarter as you scroll, and you still get that same addictive feel of scrolling through it to find this new highlight, right? And it's all completely randomized in that feed. So that was kind of when I began kind of warming up to Readwise a little more than I did in the beginning. Now, let me tell you the next phase of this that really kind of changed the game for me. So I love, I'm subscribed to a ton of newsletters, right? And a lot of people put time and effort into their newsletters to the degree that it might as well be coming from a book. This is an important, discovery that I may have come across. And often it just disappears in your inbox, right? Where like you could put it in a folder, but you still have to go back into your inbox to kind of access this again. And so what you can do is basically Readwise has this other app called Reader. And at first I was like, why would they separate these two apps? Why not just keep it in one? But you'll get it once you start using it. So Readwise is their app that is totally for the highlights and everything that I just described, right? But the Reader is basically, how there's Instapaper where you can kind of forward articles and save them for later. It serves a similar purpose, but I would take it a step further. This is what blew my mind. So not only can I forward an email that I really like and it gets sent to my Reader feed or Reader library, and then I can kind of make highlights in that newsletter, so the parts that really stood out to me, and it will get saved into my Readwise along with all the books that I have. So just like you have highlights from books, you will have highlights from newsletters. And then if you want to take it a step further, this is actually what I find one of the most worth it features, because there's two tiers, by the way, right? There's like a tier that's just Readwise. It's more affordable. It's like, I think $4.99, $5.99, something like that. And then if you want to get the Readwise and Reader, it's $12.99. And so this is where you're like, is it really worth it? And you can decide for yourself after I tell you this. But basically, when you come across a long podcast or a YouTube video, but you're like, I'm not going to watch all of this. I don't have time to do that right now. I wish I could just skim through the transcript and kind of get what I need, right? Or when you come across a game-changing episode and you're like, oh, I wish I could save this moment. And I don't have to like when I do that, I typically pause it and then rewind it, and then I will manually type it out in the Notes app. But imagine copying the link to a YouTube video or podcast and basically pasting it in the Reader app. And what it does is it pulls up the transcript for you so you can read it like a document and make highlights to that video the exact same way you would for an article or a book. And here's the kicker, there's no limits as of now in terms of how many videos you can actually, put into the Reader app. Because if they were using transcription technology of their own, where they're coming up with the transcripts, this app would be way more expensive. And you would have a limit in terms of how many hours you could probably, put in here per month. But because the transcripts are being pulled from YouTube, right? And so as long as most videos have set their language as English or auto or whatever, YouTube does the expensive part of generating the transcript for that video. And then basically what Reader does is pulls that transcript, and it does it very quickly. Like an hour plus long episode, will get done in like 10 seconds. You don't even have to leave the app. Like it'll populate the whole thing within seconds. So that feature alone made it kind of be like, whoa, of course the highlights and all that stuff is great, but this feature alone is kind of something I've been waiting for. And I love that they have blended that. Now, coming back to why are Reader and Readwise two separate apps, I find that if they had blended them together, Readwise would not feel as beautiful and simplistic as it is right now. And so over the last couple months, I have actually grown into opening up the app. I know that there's the browser version. I do use that as well. But even more than the browser version, I use the app, right? So I have Reader and Readwise both on kind of like one of the main pages on my phone. And so I will open up the Readwise app every day. And one of the fun things about it is the simplicity of what it looks like. So when you open it up, you have the daily review up top, right? And so this is kind of, you can set the amount of highlights you want to review, it randomizes it, and you can kind of keep a running streak going if you do that every day. That part's cool. But the part that you'll see underneath that is chat with your highlights. This is absolutely insane, because what this does is it's like having this database of all of your highlights, everything you've ever read, and you can ask it like, hey, can you pull up some research on how the brain can remember stuff better, right? And what it will do is it will go through all of your books, all of your highlights, and it will basically, similar to how you type in a request on ChatGPT, that's what it looks like. You basically will type that and it will store that as a chat, and it's kind of it's pulling all the certain highlights up with links to which book it's referencing. And so you get to see these connections between your books that the Ryan Holiday and Robert Greene system was designed for, right? Being able to see your note cards growing, being able to make connections between these ideas and making new connections between them. So that feature is huge, right? And I don't use that as often as, I hope to. The one that I use even more are the two below it. So you have the highlights feed, which is one of my favorites, because what this does is every time you hit it, it kind of randomly mixes the highlights together, and you can kind of scroll through it, an endless scroll, and keep kind of revisiting a large variety of stuff that you have read. And then over time, as some of these pop up, what you can do is favorite them. So I love to do that because you can search and sort through your highlights based off tags, and favorites is a tag. So that's always nice to do. But the next thing that is a crazy useful feature for learning things faster, right, is the mastery feed. So the mastery feed is not going to show up for you until you basically add something to that. So an example of how you would do that is like, okay, let's say that I'm looking at a highlight, right? So let's say I'm looking at a highlight and I hit the master button at the bottom. So what you do is when you tap the master button, you can basically pick a word. You can't pick more than one word really. So it's the kind of thing where if I pick, let's say in this thing, if I choose first, right? Or let's say I choose work. Basically, if a word appears more than once, yes. So I just chose a word. One conversation. So conversation is a word that appears 3 times in this highlight. It's going to take away that word so that now whenever it shows it to me, I basically have to take a guess at what that word is before I reveal the key phrase. And, this is something I covered in an episode on, a book that I did called Make It Stick, where it's a very densely science-backed book on learning. And one of the things it talks about is how struggle and the ability to recall before you're given the answer is huge in terms of ingraining learning. So even if the answer is incorrect, you taking a shot at trying to figure out what that is helps make it stick better. So I love that this is kind of built into the app. And, once you kind of hit save there, you can reveal key phrase, you see what it looks like, and then show this highlight again, never, soon, later, someday. So I usually just hit later and then you move on. So once you have added at least one highlight into kind of the master category, you're going to begin to actually see it now on the homepage review feed on the app, right? So that was something that didn't show up in the beginning. It took me a little while before I fiddled around and discovered that. And I was like, whoa, this is absolutely genius. So at any time, if you hit the mastery feed, anything you've chosen where you've taken away those keywords and you want to play kind of like a flashcard game almost, you can do that with your highlights. And so again, being able to just look at the beauty and simplicity of this app, I understand why you wouldn't put Reader into the same thing. Because if you open the Reader app, it is like you've got a home tab, a library tab, feed tab, search tab, account tab, and it can, not to say that it can get messy, but I can see if you were to combine the two, how it could very quickly get messy. So it is nice that they are both, its own app. And I think this is actually it's made for people who want to consume media in a more of a modern way. But in the midst of all that consumption, you don't just want to constantly lose everything that you are learning. And so one, there's the timeless aspect of how information has traveled through books, right? But in 2025 and beyond, like we are listening to podcasts, we're reading newsletters, you've got tweets that contain sometimes really dense and good information, right? And so Readwise has made that available. You can take a tweet and you can forward that into your reader and save that just like highlight from a book. So I love that they're taking this mixed media approach, because what it does is it allows the focus. I wrote about this in my first chapter of Pod Mahal, not first chapter, but a chapter of Pod Mahal called, function over form, right? So instead of constantly obsessing over the form that something will take, oh, will this be a note card, or will it be in my Readwise app, or will it just be a highlight? It's focusing on the function. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to make connections. I'm trying to learn this stuff faster. I'm trying to, use it in day-to-day life and apply it to problems, right? So that's the core function I'm trying to serve with this stuff. And I found that focusing on that allows me to let go of whether it is an app or whether it is, the analog system that I have come to love. And really, I've concluded what I'm going to do is use Readwise to basically continue to build out my library in this. So all my highlights will get uploaded. It'll be the digitized version of my note card system. And then I will basically continue to use the 4x6 note card method because I also find, again, that tactile feeling. I love that, right? And I love that I can actually put things in here that are beyond just highlights. So it doesn't have to be something I'm consuming. It might just be an idea I came up with, right? And similar to how it goes into my notes app to get cataloged, I like the fact that I can put it onto a note card. I can take the time to write it. So for me, it's become an extra layer of how I read, how I recall stuff versus something that is a complete replacement for a way of doing things, right? So that is something that I think put up some resistance to me using this in the first place, was like, I don't know if I want to transition to all Kindle stuff because it seems like you'll get the most out of it if you read on Kindle. Fully missing out on the fact, that's why they have the manual add highlights feature, right? So if you read in physical books, you can do it that way, or when you're reading on Kindle, you can do it that way. And so let's quickly talk about who this is actually for. Who is going to find that this is worth it? Because I can very easily see that if you used it like I did in the first 30 days, where it was like you used one of the features, you kind of barely used it, and you're like, I don't know if it's worth it, right? Then it's not for you. If you don't read in general that much, then there's not many highlights for you to be you have to capture highlights in the first place, right? And so if you find yourself to be a very voracious reader, I guess I would describe myself that way, then you're going to be able to look at this as a tool that evolves with how you are consuming stuff, right? So as you have come to consume, newsletters, and they are equally as valuable as insights that you might find in a book, being able to take advantage of and recall that information. I mean, I know for me it's valuable because I'm writing books and things like that, making content. But I do think that even if you don't do any of that, if you are reading in the first place, and it's not just maybe fiction or for entertainment, you are probably reading to learn, you're reading to solve problems, and hopefully reading to remember. And so if those are important to you, because I know not everybody's like that, I'm obsessed with capturing notes. I have notes from 15 years ago when I would listen to a podcast episode that was mentioned some legal thing that you should put in a lease before you start a gym. I would write that stuff down, right? I'm always capturing things that are interesting to me. And I think if you have that kind of habit, or you're trying to build that kind of habit, this app is something that was probably made for somebody like you. It is just an overwhelming yes once you start to actually use not even all the features. Even if you use one or two of them, in the beginning when I first discovered Readwise, I feel like I had just, in my mind, I saw it as this thing that emailed me every day and kind of mixed up my highlights. I wasn't even aware of the app and the fact that I could do the mastery thing and I could review any highlight at any time. That's the point of the 4x6 note card method, right? Is a good book might have 12 note cards. And so you're able to kind of refresh yourself on that book without reading the whole thing all over again. You're able to kind of go through all the distilled versions that your brain worked so hard to sift through in the first place. So if you primarily read on Kindle, it is an absolute totally worth it. You're probably going to get the most out of it. If you are somebody who reads mostly physical books, I think that it is still worth it, but it is going to take some work on your end to actually set up a practice to make sure you're highlighting, right? Make sure that you have maybe, once or twice a week, you're going in and actually adding and uploading things into the Readwise library. Because if you don't do that, then again, it's not really worth it because there's nothing really there. So it does depend on you putting things into the system. And as your highlights grow, as the amount of books that you read grow, as you upload more and more, it becomes this more vast library that I think increases with value as it grows, right? So when you have 5 highlights, it's not nearly as valuable as when you have 500 or 5,000. So in short, I am honestly shocked that I used it like such an idiot in the beginning. I feel so glad that I actually stuck with it, because I remember I almost canceled it after the first 30 days. Like, I don't know if I'm using it, but I'm so glad that I gave it the extra shot and tried to actually use some of the features. And I know that everyone's reading habits are different, right? So I know that some people love using it mainly on the browser version versus I rarely open the browser version. I'm always using the app version on my phone. And I find myself, instead of like going into the Kindle app and beginning to like read and highlight things on my phone when I have a couple spare minutes, I'll go into the Readwise app and kind of sift through some of my highlights. So it's a great practice that I think you can get yourself addicted to that has some more positive effects than, you know, endlessly scrolling some of the other stuff that's offered to us on a daily basis. So the verdict is that I will be keeping Readwise. I am a fan for life. I'm not partnered with them, but I wish I was, and I wish I will be someday, because it's a game-changing app. It's a game-changing invention. And again, this is such a great example, a great business principle of how it's not for everybody, right? There are some people who, like, if you don't read, this does not apply to you whatsoever, right? And then there are varying degrees of readers and people who will get something out of this, but it is so specific and solves this problem that, again, I had been envisioning, like, could I make a digital version of the 4x6 note card method? Maybe it'll be like Quizlet, and you can flip things around. And although Readwise does not have that yet, I can see how in the future they could very easily, if they wanted to, add features like that where it feels more like flashcards and things like that. But I don't think it needs to. I think it is pretty sufficient as is. And I think they offer a trial, so make sure to give it a whirl and don't just use Readwise, but pair it with the Reader app and doing some of the things I mentioned with picking long videos that would normally take you weeks to consume, but you could skim through it in a couple minutes. So I hope this was useful. Make sure to like, subscribe wherever you're at, and leave a comment with what you thought. I would love to hear from you. Appreciate you taking the time and hanging out, and I will see you on the next one.